Okay, can everyone hear me all right?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Please do all POIs audibly. So just unmute yourself and say point. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. A myopic attitude towards the Horn of Africa solidifies the very problems we aim to solve. The long-term thinking that caters to the very needs of the African states are embodied by the very principles and values of the African Union proud to propose. First, into the setup of this debate. I'll answer two questions in the characterization. First, what is the African Union? We think that the AU has three main purposes. First, of socio-economic development. Second, of addressing peace and security, and third, of promoting unity and solidarity. It works under the Agenda 2063, and it pursues flagship projects to meet these specific three goals. But secondly, what does growing Gulf influence look like? We think that it is mainly economic and socio-political, specifically such as driving economic development through the investments in ports or manufacturing and other economic sectors, or actively influencing the regional security through military training and establishment of military bases. On our side, the model would look like the African Union is likely to intervene in many different ways depending on the specific activity that the Gulf states are carrying out. More so, we think that the AU Assembly has the power to implement technical barriers to entry to contain economic activity by the Gulf, such as using tariffs or limiting access to seaports and just de-incentivizing the other trading partners to replace the Gulf. Two metrics for this debate. Firstly, where do we have better regional development? Second, that will prove to you that this is consistent with the AU's principles and values. With that, let's go on to our first argument on geopolitical threats, where I will prove to you that the context of geopolitical competition in the Gulf has spilled over into the Horn of Africa, endangering regional stability. We think that Gulf states are using the Horn of Africa as proxies to their internal Gulf rivalries. Why is this so? Very important context to understand, panel, is that in 2017, there was a crisis amongst the Gulf states where the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain cut ties with Qatar upon accusing Qatar of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and developing links with Iran. This context in itself has aggregated political stability in the Horn of Africa as the Gulf influence actively exports this conflict into the area. What does this look like? Firstly, when Somalia was elected to remain neutral in this specific conflict, the UAE didn't appreciate that Somalia wouldn't support the UAE, and thus the UAE stopped training missions for Somalia security forces and just allowed Somalia to pursue their existing tensions in their area. But this also looks like when Qatar decided to withdraw its peacekeeping forces in the Djibouti-Eritrea border because the countries themselves aligned with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. We think this is a massive, massive issue because the Gulf's overwhelming presence and push for proxy conflicts is a disregard for African security in favor of simple strategic gains for the Gulf. We think that this necessarily trickles down into first the fluctuating support from the Gulf, right? We think commercial projects are at best meant to consolidate political relations and gain greater influence in the regional politics. Thus, these Gulf actors will always maintain and act in ways that are most politically convenient for them, and that means connecting whatever of their economic agendas to the political ones that are extremely unstable. But secondly, we think that this trickles down into actively threatening government stability, because when there are clashing agendas amongst the Gulf states, it breeds the lack of unity within the Horn of Africa, as the Horn is stuck in the Gulf enmity and are expected to support either the UAE Saudi Arabia alliance or actively support the Qatari. Under this context, why is the African Union the best actor to intervene? We think that firstly, we have a lot more representation of local issues. We think because the AU does have regional bodies working to contextualize the issues of member countries, it is the only organization that can provide a specialized problem solution matches. We think that external actors such as the Gulf will actively prioritize their socio-economic incentives over whatever is beneficial for the stability of regional states. And we think that this is extremely important. But the second reason that the AU is important is understanding its incentives of the Agenda 2063. The AU wants to promote good governance basing upon democratic principles. What does this look like? We think that the AU recognizes because there is a lack of established democratic transitions amongst the Horn of Africa, they want to actively support the Horn of Africa states and providing mechanisms like helping create policies that regulate elections or just condemning member states that don't act constitutionally. And we think these actions are of interest to the Horn of Africa and seem favorable because this is going to lead them to actually structural growth and institutional development that is important for vulnerable and weaker states like the Horn of Africa. We think the huge impact of this is that the continued Gulf presence implies an instability of projects as the Horn is merely a pawn in the Gulf's rivalry. Before I move on to my second argument, your point.
Since Agenda 2063, there has been more conflict in Western Sahara and the Somalia war continues to happen. How can the AU be successful given past failures then?
No, we disagree. We think that the flagship projects that I'm going to expand more on my second argument are actively helping the Horn of Africa, and that these states should actively use all of their resources and efforts that they have to be able to rely on the African Union rather than like whatever political instability that you want to claim on your side. Now with that, let's move on to our second argument on economic influence, where we will prove to you that the relationship of dependence that is fostered between the Gulf and the Horn actively jeopardizes economic prosperity. We think that the relationship between the Gulf and the Horn is extremely asymmetrical and that the former is able to exploit the latter. We think that the huge problem here is that the economic projects created by the Gulf are reaping away money from the region through stealing ownership. This means two key things. Firstly, the Horn of Africa states are losing sovereignty over key regions. This looks like in 2014, where Djibouti had a deal with the UAE to build the largest port in the Gulf of Aden, but in 2017, Djibouti actively tried to nationalize the port and take control, but the UAE retaliated, brought the issue to international court, and rescinded the port to the UAE. We think that the huge consequences here, panel, are that it's less likely for there to be trickle-down economic benefits for the Horn because the capital gain will just maintain within the Gulf countries, right? Even if you can use the Horn of Africa's people and resources, the ultimate profit goes to the Gulf. But the second level that happens is that the opportunity cost that prevails against inter-AU projects. Because government expenditure is limited, meaning there's only so much money you can gain from taxation in the specifically impoverished region, we think that there's a trade-off between spending resources on external development like the Gulf investment and the internal development that happens with the AU's efforts. We think that the AU's economic initiatives are a lot more favorable and are a priority for the Horn of Africa's nations because it is able to foster regional integration and boost intra-African trade. This specifically looks like the creation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is one of the largest free trade areas in the world. And we think that at the end of the day, these specific efforts are a lot more important than the economic benefits that the Gulf can give you, because not only did we tell you that these economic efforts are strongly binded to fluctuating political agendas, but the very fact is that we attain regional integration. We think that it is better for the Horn to have strong economic partners in the closest region and neighboring countries, as these are the alliances that are going to get them a lot more significant voice and standing rather than being stuck in these asymmetrical relations. We think that stability and development is best fostered to the AU. Extremely proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech, taking a second to note take. Thank you so much. O1, whenever you're ready.
Am I visible and audible?
Yep.
For some reason, I'm shaking with coldness. So, well. POI in the chat, please. Yeah, that shall be all. A moment. First, responses to the ideas of internal fragmentation. One, I think that this trend is already reducing when we see that Qatar and Saudi renormalize relations in 2020, and conflicts between them never actually get explicit due to codependency, proximity, and international checks and balances. Number two, even if fragmentation happens, it happens in a coalition line because all of the Gulf countries or small states with the same ideologies, they depend on OPEC and oil and have common enemies that are Iran, Turkey, and the West. And three, we think some level of competition is actually good because competition across all these investors force them to present deals with the best value to the Horn of African countries in order to be accepted instead of their rivals. And the existence of alternatives prevents the worst harms of exploitation. The moment one actor has one extortionate deal, others can easily show up with fairer options and win the playoff. Proposition needs to do a harder burden and prove why fragmentation is bad. Second issue on exploitation. And note, in the entire proposition's case is based on one premise: the Gulf states have very short-term and exploitative incentives. No, thank you. One, and that why this is wrong. Because one, Horn of Africa is a source of the Nile and a choke point for trade passing through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Thus, the economically dependent Gulf has to sustainably secure the economic situation there. Two, violence uprisings or insurgencies like the Arab Springs may have spill-on effects on these Gulf states by undermining their own governments. The presence of Iran and Turkey is also a security threat. Thus, Gulf states have to secure long-term stability. And third, Gulf states have economic needs such as diversification from oil and food insecurity that can only be supplied by the stability and prosperity of the Horn. And that is why needs are going to be structural, long-term, and executed in a good way. And last issue on the African Union. Three quick things to note here. One, things such as, intra-African trade and all that is not mutually exclusive. We can also promote that. There's nothing in the motion to say that we cannot have that on our side. But number two, note that the African Union is extremely limited in resources, especially after so many conflicts happening in the West Saharan, in the Chariot Lake, in the Red Lake, etc., and the COVID-19 pandemic. It's unrealistic to believe they are so capable as proposition claims. And lastly, they have limited legitimacy, i.e., normally they cannot intervene in any country's internal decisions except under very extreme measures. And that is why we don't think this is actually in line with their principles to intervene in economic development. No, thank you. What is our stance then? Very simple, 3 points. One, the EU should welcome Gulf influence and play a role in coordinating and deal making in Horn of Africa for the simple reason that collective bargaining power is good. Two, the aim is to make basic trade and ground rules, as is the case with every trade agreement. For example, the USMCA framing out abusive behavior in North America, even though the United States is the most pro-free trade country in the world. And third, the bottom line difference here is that we welcome and we want a lot of Gulf investment, unlike proposition. Before moving on, I took the point. Go. Point. No?
A precondition of your case existing is that in many instances, the Gulf needs for them to be isolated and on their own such that they can be successful. That is to say, if the AU simultaneously promotes Pan-Africanism, then obviously you start to create fictionalized relationships amongst the Gulf and the AU. Why is that good?
I don't think that is a true dichotomy. In every case of every trade agreement in the world, you can always have someone deal making for yourself, and it does not have to exist in binary. For example, Asian countries accept BRI with the ASEAN dealing on behalf of us. That is literally the status quo. Do a better job of explaining. First argument, Gulf influence alleviates poverty and empower economies. First, let's understand the trend of growing investment into Horn of Africa from the Gulf states. From 2000 to 2017, Gulf states invested 13 billion USD into the Horn of Africa. This is more than 4 times entire GDP of Djibouti in 2021, which is 3 billion. Two, investments are both diverse and long-term. For example, in Somali territory, UAE-owned logistics companies have recently won 30-year contracts to develop deep-sea ports. UAE also deposited $1 billion into filling Ethiopia's central banks, and Qatar is a leading investor in public infrastructures, hospitals, and schools in Somalia. Second, why growth happens in a good way. One, because the long-term interests at the top of my speech necessitate economic deals being long-term. Two, Gulf states are vested in the self-sustainability of Horn of Africa, since it means that they have to directly give less money in the future and get more profits from business. Three, investments are diffused over many sectors as illustrated above, rather than centralized. This simultaneously stimulates the economy all around and decreases dependence on any particular Gulf state. 3, terminalization impacts. Why this is so beneficial? 1, the fact that Gulf state needs to establish a stable grain supply due to the non-arable lands. So they modernize agriculture, Horn of Africa's culture, supplying them with seeds, tractors, machines, processing factories, fertilizers, pesticides. This increases grain yield, which solves literal famines in the region and decreases prices of basic necessities. Since 61% of Horn African countries' people depend on agriculture, this systemically uplifts their livelihood. 2, infrastructure such as ports, hospitals, schools, roads ensure people trade routes for 30 years to come, enabling economic activities. They also allow people to immediately access the most basic human rights. No, thank you. 3, the Gulf needs to secure a stable consumer base of oil to combat price fluctuations from the Westward sanctions. This constant and cheap oil supply allow Horn of Africa to produce industrial goods, electricity, fuels, and cooking gas at a much cheaper prices, which is crucial for survival. 4, build bases of economies such as infrastructure or agriculture beget more investment, creating a non-stop virtuous cycle of money and development. Second argument, Gulf state intervention mediate interstate conflicts. 1, why the African Union has failed to curb interstate conflicts. The African Union has put a great deal on promoting peace, but since the Agenda 2063, conflicts in Africa have increased. There's fighting in Western Sahara, the Somali civil war, the Allied Democratic Forces insurgencies in Uganda. 2 structural reasons for this failure. 1, because of a collective action problem. In every ceasefire, states want to preemptively strike to gain a combative edge and for fear the other side doing the same thing. Therefore, the need is to find an incentive strong enough to override this. 2, states lack faith in a common actor who is capable of reinforcing negotiation terms and who have strong previous ties and demographic appeal. Now, second layer, how Gulf states uniquely curb instability then. 1, via cash. Different factions all need money and resources in order to operate, and this self-preservation overrides any other incentives of preemptive strike. So the Gulf offering money to all sides of conflicts enables sustainable ceasefires. 2, demographic appeal based on religious backgrounds. There's a degree of distrust between the people in the Horn and Western states stemming from decades of imperialism and colonial exploitation. The majority of the region is Muslim, conduct the Hajj who generally have a more positive of the Gulf states. Thus, we solve the no trust game. The third argument on why causes the worst harms of codependency. The framing here is simple. Horn of African countries' main investors are China and Gulf states. To the extent the Gulf influence decreases, dependency on Chinese in BRI increases because they need money. Then why then dependency on China is bad? First, economic deals are going to be more coercive, so you cannot say no. Second, deals are much less benign when China knows that you have zero other alternatives and you have to depend on them. And third, Chinese investments prioritize the benefits. It looks like dumping unemployed workers to Horn of Africa for work and surplus goods that edge out local workers and businesses. And even worse, take ownership of even industries that otherwise would belong to the people. What do we need for our next speaker is a comprehensive account of why the alternatives that are often so much much worse are worth the trade-off of containment of Gulf influence. So proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech. P2, whenever you're ready.
Hello, sorry, am I audible?
Yes, loud and clear.
Amazing. It is precisely the short-term thinking imposed by side opposition which cements the endemic weaknesses to African nations. In my speech, you will hear two clashes that will respond to why side proposition is currently winning this debate. First, on economic development, and second, on stability. Afterwards, I will provide a third argument that responds to even if all the benefits on side opposition are true, the disproportionate effect on vulnerable minorities that will occur if the Gulf intervention persists in the status quo is enough for you to give a valid to side proposition. Now, first of all, let me talk about economic development. The first thing that I believe is important for me to clarify under this clash is why we believe that the type of economic development that occurs from the side of the African Union is exclusive. I believe that Nanami already gave you a sufficient mechanism in the moment when she tells you that the majority of the investment that is carried out in the status quo is contingent on taxation. To that extent, governments within the Horn of Africa have to make a decision as to whether or not they want to put money into like the relationship that they have to the Gulf or into the projects that are like supported by the African Union. But even if you don't buy that these are like exclusive projects, we believe that we will prove to you that the type of economic development that is fostered by the African Union is enough such that the type of investment that the Gulf brings to like this status quo is something that isn't desirable. But now, what does opposition bring? The first thing that they bring on rebuttal is this idea on how competition ultimately brings for like a maximization of benefits among the countries within the Horn of Africa. What we would say is that we rather believe that the Gulf has incentives to flood these markets in the short term and have military bases there as fast as possible. We do not believe that like the situation is escalated to the extent where there is yet competition. Rather, they are trying to gain as much ground as possible, precisely because of the regional competition within the Gulf that Nanami already characterized. But now to their big first argument, where they talk to you about foreign investments, ports, and how like this type of investment is diffused over many sectors. I have three very big lines of rebuttal to this. The first is crucially what Nanami told you in our second argument, which is the fact that in the majority of cases, Gulf states have an incentive to remove ownership from like the countries within the Horn of Africa. And they are in such a disproportionately powerful position where they are the ones that bring in all of the money for the creation of this infrastructure that they can dictate the percentage of ownership that these countries within the Horn of Africa has. Why do we believe that this impact is something that is so extremely harmful? Because crucially, the money that this ports and this infrastructure could gain or could create from like exporting goods solely goes to the Gulf states rather than it having a rippling effect, not only on the workers within these sorts of ports, but also within like the general population of the cities where these ports are hosted. We believe that this is particularly detrimental when we understand that the vast majority of things that these Horn countries export are actually primary raw resources, to the extent where they are continuously depleting their resources, where at one point they won't be able to carry out this economic activity. We believe that the fact that they aren't able to gain economics short term in their economic benefits in the short term, while at the same time depleting their own resources, is something that you should really care about. Second line of analysis is the fact that we believe that side opposition, and especially these Gulf countries, have a huge incentive to provide low wages and high exploitation for these local workers. We believe that on the comparative, the African Union can impose labor laws and like actually impose them through like regional workers that exist there, but also because these are the individuals who solely reap the benefits from their economic transactions, then they have an incentive to actively be sustainable. But the third and I believe most important line of rebuttal for this debate is that opposition crucially offers a problem-solution mismatch in that they don't respond to the current context of the Horn of Africa and to the actual necessities that these individuals have. The first reason is that they never truly told you why unemployment is a crucial issue in the status quo. We told you the level of unemployment within Djibouti is only 5.8%. In Eritrea, it is only 6.4%, and in Ethiopia, it's only 5.2%. To that extent, we don't believe that the type of economic development that side opposition is talking about actually addresses the issues that the Horn of Africa is facing in the status quo. But secondly, is that the majority of the labor force within the Horn of Africa countries isn't actually qualified to just transition into these ports. I believe that the fact that side opposition never actually mentioned the transition period is something that is extremely detrimental, because what that means is that the 70% of the Ethiopian labor force that is currently working in agriculture will be structurally unemployed in the moment when they can't move from one economic area to another because they lack training and because they lack the skills. We believe that this lack of forward thinking from side opposition is what crucially loses them this clash on economic development, which must much rather build on the economic integration that is already occurring within the Horn of Africa, and to rely on the African Union to do these sorts of things. But now on to my second clash, where I will talk to you about stability. Side opposition brings this second argument where they talk to you about how these Gulf countries are extremely effective like mediators of conflict. I believe that this is a direct clash with our first argument, where Nanami tells you that these Gulf countries actually actively exacerbate issues because they only treat the Horn of Africa countries as proxies rather than them actually treating them as like countries that need help. We believe that the response that we receive from side opposition on like they have good relationships now isn't enough. We tell you not only did like the United Arab Emirates literally stop training military forces within Somalia that were actively fighting terrorism, but it then went to Somaliland, which is currently like a region within Somalia that isn't considered legitimate, and exacerbated conflicts between them. We believe that this is further like exemplified by the fact that, for example, the majority of Saudi Arabia investment is moving from Eritrea into Ethiopia, regions that were previously in conflict, which has two impacts. The first is that it further breeds local conflict, as was explained by Nanami. But the second is that you crucially create dependence where these countries aren't able to resolve their conflicts on their own, such that this crucially becomes sustainable. Finally, we believe that the extent of militarization and government intervention that occurs from the Gulf countries leads to a state where these individuals lose control over their own population because citizens view more presence of like authorities from Gulf countries than they see from their own country. In the moment when side opposition simply breeds internal instability, we believe that their side is one that is extremely undesirable. Before I move on to my third argument.
In 2018, Saudi Arabia and UAE brokered a peace deal between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which both these countries failed to do before and the AU failed to address. How can you change these problems without the mech we provided?
Look, we believe that the fact that you're like championing past things that the Gulf countries did well aren't relevant in the moment when in the status quo, because of the economic incentives driving the political influence of these countries within the Horn of Africa, we believe that that far outweighs it. Now, onto my third argument, which crucially responds to the characterization brought on the framework on side opposition on like the necessities of the Gulf and why that makes them long-term thinking. The point of this argument is that the economic presence of the Gulf is so detrimental to the Horn that it requires urgent intervention from the African Union. And crucially, this looks like the systemic sale of natural resources. The economic presence of the Gulf in the Horn of Africa has primarily centered around like agricultural projects. Why? Because as opposition explained, Gulf state magnates desperately need to find cheap, stable food sources to offer like and because African governments are extremely cash needy, then they offer like a very well alternative. There are two problems with this. The first is that most Horn of Africa countries are actually facing food shortages themselves, which means that there's a high need for these resources and they're selling away their ability to feed their own population. But the second and most crucial issue is the fact that foreign companies actually force Horn of Africa populations off of their land and leave them with two alternatives. One, either they move off to just like far isolated, marginalized areas where they have significantly worse access to basic services such as healthcare and education, or two, they have to move to neighboring states, forcing them to compete for resources and jobs with other populations of different ethnic backgrounds, such that they create conflict not only between local communities themselves, but also between local communities and like the companies themselves. We believe that the impact of this is that crucially, the presence of the Gulf is actively hurting the most vulnerable minorities within the Horn of Africa, something which makes this policy extremely illegitimate. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech. O2 whenever you're ready.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep, loud and clear. Love your hair.
Let's take a moment to characterize what these economic deals really look like before I move on to two questions in my speech and my extension. First, what do these deals actually look like? Because I think the framing that we got from first and second on their side is that these deals only benefit one actor, so i.e. the donor of the donor of cash money or whatever. I think this is quite hard to buy for two reasons, because I think first, the donor's benefit often depends on the recipients being able to grow themselves and being able to develop by themselves because of two main reasons. First, because there are direct impacts to these Horn of African countries developing themselves in order for the Gulf to have diminishing investment time by time, because if you grow as a region, you have much less investment needing to pour to these countries. But the second reason why it's often true that these deals will have benefits on both sides is because things such as giving our culture and equipment that Home told you in first, for these Gulf states to have a stable grain supply benefits these average citizens on their ground, because it means that they can afford basic necessities cheaply. So I think that because of these two reasons, it's often a reasonable context that these deals do benefit both sides. But sure, the trade-off that we have to take here on opposition can be things like these deals, even though they have enormous economic benefits, they also tie these countries to a political conflict. Like if you receive cash money to me, you often have to side with me in a political spectrum, for example, like the idea that they said about Qatar, UAE, and Somalia. But the comparative is there's much more investment on our side, but higher chances of these deals being exploitative, versus lower investment on their side, but higher likelihood of them not being exploitative. So how should you weigh these two impacts? I think there are two metrics here. First is in terms of self-solvency. That is, the additional layer of investment that we get can be used to offset the worst harms on their side. Because insofar as the harms of the deals being exploitative is that it narrows the choice, or quote unquote on their side, loses ownership of whatever happens in these Horn of African countries. We have proved to you that we get more choice, we expand sovereignty for these people by attracting more investment to these areas, and thus it solves the worst harms on their side about it being exploitative deals. But the second reason why we also solve their worst harms is because things like economic benefits can allow these countries to not get dependent on one actor that may give them exploitative deals. But the last weighing metric here is in terms of directness. I just think that it's very counterintuitive to say that like a political conflict or something in politics would have as much direct impact on a person's life as much as literally building a port that allows them to trade and exchange their goods, or building things like having more oil supply for these individuals so that they can go to work without having to worry about how they will get their gas from. So I think these kind of things means that we already win on economic benefits. But what else did a proposition tell you? I think first, the idea about like not allowing countries to nationalize ports, and then you remove sovereignty. I just want to note that like this example that they gave is empirically untrue, since their analysis relies on the example instead of like MEX. So I think the example about like the Djibouti not being able to nationalize is untrue, because it's the barriers for them to nationalize are actually justified, because what Djibouti did was that it removes the company manager, and then it just wipes out what the UAE did, and then it turns all the assets of that company to a state-run company. So I think what they did is quite unjustified. But fine, let's allow them to have the idea about sovereignty. There are three responses. First is that you still benefits from port, even if it cannot be nationalized, because it's still there as a tangible asset. But two, the time period between infrastructure of ports that are built to the moment when it can be lost on your side, for example, is still enough to uplift massively amount of people on our side. But the last thing that I would say here is what Hum told you in the third argument, right? About why choice and sovereignty increases rapidly, because the alternative on their side are BRI, which are more predatory and offer loans on unsustainable debt levels, which allow these countries to be in debt traps even more. But the second thing they tell you under this is that like regional competition doesn't exist because countries just go there as soon as possible and wipe out all competition. Yeah, it doesn't, but that doesn't mean though that actors can still fly in and allow more deals in order for their self-preservation incentive of having a facade of legitimacy, so that the Horn of African countries will often choose themselves instead of other peers. And I think this idea about competition that who brought to you is quite important, because it wipes out all of their benefit, all of their harms about exploitation the moment in which we think Gulf states have long-term interests and also quite benign interests, because that's basically how they will secure trade deal. Okay, onto my extension then about why attempts to contain Gulf influence is immensely bad and destabilizing. The first way in which this happened is through the internal loss of legitimacy. Countries really want to trade with Gulf states. So when the AU stepped to limit that Gulf influence, it often looks like opposition parties criticizing the AU's decision in parliament through media coverage, for example, or business elites in the private sector deciding that the AU goes against their interests. This translates to, first, member states putting pressure on the AU to limit its power in the Horn and across the continent. Or second, less compliance by member states with the AU's future projects or requests. Since politics is often quid pro quo, so when countries do not get what they want, they would not exchange their interests for the AU. There are two harms of this. First, the AU often plays an integral role in carrying out humanitarian tasks. And note, this also engages with the idea about vulnerable communities, which will be debilitated by the lack of buy-in from member states. This looks like countries not willing to invest money in AU's budget, which cripples its ability to carry out poverty alleviation, or members not wanting to send soldiers to its peacekeeping operations. The second harm is there are much fewer international projects such as energy development that can be carried out on their side, because they also rely on consent from all countries. The second part of this argument is that it's destabilizing through external force. As Home told you, the Horn is of key strategic importance to the Gulf, and they would try every way to develop the region, whether through investment or funding insurgency groups, which have been a tried and tested strategy for Gulf states from manipulating oil prices. Currently, though, as investment is not limited on our side, Gulf states would choose investment because it maximizes return and is much less costly than funding wars. When investment is restricted on their side, it compels Gulf countries to replace the AU with these insurgency groups that they have control over to clear the way for the infrastructure that they want. This has happened before. When Iran starts to nationalize oil and stops giving oil to the US under the new government, the US funds military coup to weaken the new government Shah in Iran. Insofar as people on our side can earn an income, feed their families without being caught in crossfires, all other indirect benefits on their side fall secondary. Gulf influence is uniquely able to provide this, while any other actors would be far worse, and for this, vote up.
We thank the speaker for their fine speech, and to wrap up this round for today, let's have P3.
Okay, cool. Can you hear me? I'll try to turn on my camera.
I can, but you're a little soft.
Cool. Yeah, I'll just do my best. I normally shout as I speak, so it'll probably be fine. Is it fine though?
Audible as you started to speak up.
Cool. Okay, yeah. Just for context, my camera is weird as hell. So it's on my keyboard. So if I look really weird and like I'm looking at another place, it's not really okay. Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. At the top of my speech, I want to be very clear about two assertions from team opposition. The first thing to note is their huge assertion on why the likely counterfactual is just China, without really explaining why that's the case. They really do mechanize why China is likely to be problematic, in most instances talking about problems that are intrinsic also to the Gulf, but we don't really understand why that's a more likely thing to happen. It'll be extremely clear why this is not necessarily the case, and why even if it is, we win this point. But the second thing to note is I think they do drop the majority of responses that Mariana gives on how they're on how the conflicts and the particular exporting of conflicts between the two axes in the Gulf, in the Gulf, has not really been solved. I want to note that at the end of the day, even if they did manage to sign an agreement between Qatar and the UAE, these are the same agreements that they have been creating and breaking for the past few decades. And opposition never pushed on why is it that this is particularly good, other than saying, oh, but they have a deal. Insofar as that's the case, 3 points of clash. First, on development, second, on geopolitics, and thirdly, I will talk about generally what the likely alternatives are and why that is comparatively better, and why anything that happens is comparatively better to what opposition talks about. The first thing to note on the point of development is the thing that Mariana gives and the new response that we give on this point that receives no answer to, which is that the transition period does really matter. I think opposition generally gives you good engagement as to why the types of investment that you bring are generally good, and I'll address those in a second. But I think for the few months where this happens, and note that this is contingent on the more successful opposition are, there are three particular impacts. The first is what we already noted on how there is a significant percentage of the population that is just virtually ignored by the government. And note that this is particularly bad. This is the second response, because now there is no need for governments to be accountable. That is to say, the government in Djibouti, for the people in the ports who are now being taken by, for example, Qatar, have no necessity to actually give jobs to these people, because there is no real accountability, because the discourse that these countries have been managing for the past 3 years is that it is really not their responsibility, because they're already bringing projects from abroad. They're already bringing incentives from abroad. They're already bringing jobs from abroad. But any time that there aren't enough jobs brought by the Gulf, there are really no incentives or really no ways of pushing for the local governments to provide. I think this is one of the most important points there in the debate, because it is the point that actually tells you, even if opposition is really true, there is a trade-off that they have to engage with and that they have not managed to engage with. But let's talk about the point on competition, because I think that has been highly contentious. So opposition essentially says the point on competition is good, as if it was just like normal market rules, like the more actors are trying to compete, the more innovation, the more incentives to act. But we told you that is literally that we concede that is true, right? The more competition there is, the more clashing incentives there are, the faster and like better products these countries have to have. But the difference is that is the perfect way to actually build conflicts in this area. We told you get various examples as to why it's not just like who improves the economy of Djibouti first, but it's rather who gains control of their land first. And the problem with that was you start to have extremely predatory approachment to areas that previously didn't have enough development either way. So the very like dangerous thing is you don't even have enough transition periods where these people can move their crops to other parts of the country, for example, but rather you just go to Ethiopia and take their land. For significantly, this is problematic in most in the areas which are like needing most development on their own, because note that many of these areas, like some of these areas in Africa, like particularly in the Horn, particularly in Eritrea, are some of the areas that need most land development so that you can like develop food systems for the population. And like the very simplistic response that we hear from up to is, oh, but they can still benefit from that, from the ports and from the land that's developed. I think in many instances, this is just categorically not true. In many instances, this food is brought back home or is sold at more expensive prices to local citizens. And I think the problem here is not just the sovereignty point, but rather the fact that you don't even have a claim to the land that you had in the past. They are buying land from local like communities at prices that are really not like that are really coercive for these communities, because when you have a very good deal in the short term, but you can't really see long term as to how much you're not going to be able to then buy in the market the products that you yourself were producing, then that's extremely bad for them. But the third point to note under this point of clash is on this whole thing on like sovereignty, right? So the first response that we hear is they can still like have a claim to this and benefit from that. But I want to note that even in the instances in which they do, that was not a direct clash with the point on sovereignty, right? Even if you do get to benefit economically, that doesn't respond as to why they necessarily have a claim to that land and to those ports. And the reason why they don't is because the majority of instances, they do so without the consent of the people. And the problem here is specifically in this area where there is such a huge disconnect between local governments and their people, with massive changes, for example, in countries like Djibouti, and where particular groups, and this also clashes with their second argument of the first speaker, like with their particular nuances of certain groups that are and minorities that are misrepresented, the type of like treason that you make for these people is particularly dangerous. But let's talk about the point on geopolitics. And I want to note that when we talk about exporting conflict, this wasn't only, oh, but Qatar and the UAE fight each other, and therefore they're going to also fight in this territory. It was also about how the ways in which they approach things are fundamentally clashing, and how this happens also through soft power. So the first thing that they note is that they are good now. I want to note three things. The first thing to note is these deals have been broken in the past. But even if you don't buy that, I think that they have fundamentally different incentives. So even if they are good on paper, or they are not going to go to war against each other, they do have fundamentally different incentives, which, as Mariana and Anami noted, necessarily means that the people who resent those those problems, I'll take your POI in a second, are the people in the ground. A very clear example was the fact that, for example, like the access for the UAE and Saudi Arabia started to move their military training and their land development from Eritrea to Somalia. And the problem with this is not just that you're breeding conflicts because these are countries that are historically clashing, but also that you create the dependency on countries that you're not really going to provide for. So the problem is these countries start to depend on you, and this note engages with them being successful. But then you take of these types of incentives, and the problems are massive. Before going on as to like the next point, sure.
Political conflicts that you said on your side do not affect much because Horn of African countries are not stupid. Somalia denies Emirates flight to the UAE after they infringe on their sovereignty. There are counter checks and measures to ensure that you prevent the worst forms of abuse.
So I just want to note that POI like literally concedes two things. The first concedes that these countries have been affected enough that even though they are economically dependent, they have had to stand up against the very people that are giving them like the investment that you talk about. And the second thing to note is this recognizes that these countries are having to defend themselves on their own. Note that the comparative in this debate was never, we are never going to have trade deals with Qatar or Saudi Arabia ever again. It was just that the way in which they are developing is particularly bad, and therefore the AU must try to reduce that rate of growth. Therefore, we do say, sure, we can have those types of things, but at the rate at which it's happening, they're having to have the checks and balances, and that's really problematic. Last thing here is, at the end of the day, they talk about how they have supported peace deals. I think this has happened anyways. Like regarding their POI on the 2018 deal, the very reason for why it happened, reason why they received the Nobel Prize, was because of the historical visit of the Ethiopian President Ahmed, which actually created a lot more diplomacy than the trade deal. Sorry, the deal that the Gulf countries created. But let's talk about China, right? Like opposition says that China is comparatively bad, and the reasons that they give are that they create dependency and just create dumping. I want to be extremely clear about how that's mostly symmetrical, but even if you don't buy that, there are three reasons why China is comparatively better. One, because we think they have global incentives. That is to say, China wants to deal with more than these countries, so they have the incentives of protecting this region so that they can convince other countries in other areas, which doesn't happen with the Gulf, because if they destroy the Horn, it was really not an issue. Secondly, I think it breeds more holistic African development because they want to deal with all of Africa, not just this particular area. And lastly, because China isn't as aggressive, because there isn't an incentive, like if they lose this area, there isn't such an issue. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone.